Hello everyone, it's Ashwin Rao. In today's video, I'm bringing you a break-in update on my various goods acquired from Craft and Glory, based out of India, a rapidly emerging heritage footwear manufacturer who's become really well regarded, well known, certainly at the entry point of the heritage welted footwear segment, partly due to their high quality, obviously always a good thing, as well as their very aggressive, reasonable pricing, which has elevated them in the eyes of many in the blogosphere, as well as many customers. Craft and Glory was founded in 2017 and initially featured a wide range of leather goods. I believe they make jackets and bags, but then they have gotten to be more known in recent years, over the past couple years, for their footwear. And they have a few unique takes in terms of how they approach footwear manufacture. Most of their boots are listed as Goodyear welted, but I think there's a lot of work that's done by hand because of the craftsmen and the equipment that they've had. They also use buffalo leathers. These are full grain tanned buffalo leather, which has a very different set of properties. These are sourced locally in India and likely more affordable for them to acquire and ultimately process and tan. But buffalo leathers are not something that are very common in the heritage footwear segment. You see American bison leathers that have a very distinct grain character, but these buffalo leathers have a different handle, kind of a different feel to them, and they have a different approach to the tannage, which lends itself to unique rolls and micro creases, which I think are very appealing. This here is their saddle tan. As you can see, I'm a fan of their saddle tan because I have now 3 different items, all of my items from Craft and Glory in that colorway. But you can kind of tell if you're just looking that there is some variation in the tannage in terms of what type of color you're going to get, as well as the thickness of the leather, say in one of their belts, much thicker than say in their Ghurka boot, which is their combat style boot with a rivet, and one of my favorite boots, honestly, just an incredibly comfortable boot. And then obviously a different level of temper and thickness this engineer boot will provide when you are putting it on. So let's talk a little bit about break-in. But before I get into break-in, I just wanted to mention this belt. This was sent to me by Craft and Glory as part of my acquisition of these engineer boots. They were very kind to include this boot for review, and I wanted to take you through it. I've actually worn this a couple of times, so you can see where I've worn it, the crease where the buckle attaches. But you can see after wearing it 2 or 3 times, it is really holding up quite well to the friction of one's waist. And it has this unique stitch pattern that gives it somewhat of Western belt style vibe. No obvious rivets or jewels, just a standard belt with your typical rivets to fasten the buckle. These can be obviously removed. This is also their buffalo leather. This approach also allows us to see the rough outside of the buffalo leather, and I would love to see Craft and Glory maybe flip their leathers around and do some styles using their rough out, because the rough outside is actually rather pleasing as well. So maybe doing a rough out saddle tan might be my next ask of them. Needless to say, this belt is fashioned in your typical methods, has a really nice, not loosey-goosey belt with slight beveled edges. This is a nice blocky belt that will work well with denim as well as more casual chinos. This is obviously going to be a more casual belt. This is not something you're going to wear with dress wear. Very affordable, much more affordable than many of the other makers. And the construction, I would say, is similar to a boot from, say, Ashland Leather. This is my Dublin Ashland Leather. English tan Dublin from Horween has a different handle than this buffalo leather. This is a little stiffer, but more traditional. Very similar buckle. This one's obviously a little broader and a little bigger, but I think that's appealing to many people. And you can see this one is stitched together by Ashland versus held together by rivets, which is actually more typical of many of the belts made. So the first acquisition I got from Craft and Glory back in the earlier spring was this pair of Ghurka Boots. You can just see how beautiful this boot has been clicked and lasted, and it is just a epitome of a high quality stitched welted boot. We see a 270-degree flat welt, this really vibrant, rich red brown saddle tan leather. You can see that there's areas where the leather appears to have either darkened or is darker. And then the rolls, which kind of create a lightning effect, and the way that this guy catches light, the richness of that red-brown colorway. I actually have not conditioned these, so you can see how much of a shine that they actually develop and acquire and continue to maintain. And then in high friction points, you can see that this overcoat or color actually wears out pretty quickly to a T-core. So I'm guessing that with time and further wear, you're going to see areas such as this T-core and start to kind of match the color of the stitching. Really like the gold rivet here, as well as the brass eyelets. To me, one thing I would have suggested is maybe matching the eyelets and the rivet, because this looks more like an antique brass, but honestly, really nice. I also like the pitch and curve of this top part of the collar here. It's reminiscent of that Iron Ranger style with that kind of swooping curve, just not as dramatic. And otherwise, beautiful boot. You can see a slight stitch down at the bottom. Call that the butt stitch. Looks like a plumber's crack. It's one thing I would love to see go away eventually, but you know, for the price you're paying, you can't really fault that at all, and it may just be a stylistic choice. The triple row of stitches leading from the counter into the heel stay, all really well done. The quadruple stitching here, just everything about this boot is distinct. There's not really another boot like this, and one thing that other makers are faulted for is copying other styles and brands that have been made popular by other makers. Craft and Glory is sort of doing their own thing, which I really like. Here at the highest crease point, which is usually on the mid vamp, you can see how that creasing, but within the context of rolling, forms, and it's actually really beautiful. This is something that I know Dale has appreciated in terms of the high quality. Dale from Dale's Leatherworks and a few others who have looked at Craft and Glory have remarked upon is how that leather ages. And I just find this boot to be incredibly comfortable, incredibly stylistic. The veg tan midsole and outsole and welt here all are reasonable quality. I would say if there's one area where things by hand feel a little less than maybe other brands, is that this lasting board and outsole slash midsole area here feels a little cheaper, I guess, but again, for the price, hard to argue with. You can see a little bit of heel drag. I tend to create a fair bit of heel drag, but nothing dissimilar from known brands such as Vibram or others. This is actually a really high quality rubber that has nice traction, and it's Craft and Glory branded nitrile oil resisting anti-slip leather. So not leather, rubber. So really nice boot, shape, roll. This to me is one of my favorite boots, certainly at the budget end, favorite generally overall. And I would say if Craft and Glory can ultimately, you know, just do a little bit extra on the fit and finish of, say, the midsoles and their outsoles, just kind of creating a little bit more of a color there. I don't know, maybe like darkening this a little bit or changing the hand feel so it's a little thicker. I think we'll be right there at the very top of the pile, regardless of price, for something that's essentially hand welted, hand lasted, and with machine stitched uppers. Hard to argue. I would be remiss if I did not make mention of the Fade Department laces that I have added here. Fade Department is a brand coming out of Canada, have these beautiful paracord style laces with metal aglets, which I think are great. They are a really nice match for this boot, and very happy with those. So I wanted to make mention. I actually purchased 2 of my own after I received a couple for free, and just really think that they're nice laces. Here, I wanted to make some comments about this beautiful engineer, which has been now reviewed both on this channel as well as on the channels of others. Again, this saddle tan leather I think is just wonderful, and you can see how this leather is rolling, particularly on the shaft here. I've probably worn this boot, I don't know, 15 to 20 times at this point, and you can see that that break-in is happening really graciously. This leather, interestingly, feels stiffer to me. I think it's probably thicker than this leather, which has a more supple feel. You can see kind of what I'm talking about here, at least visually. It's nice and soft here. You can see how much of that leather moves. And if I bring this leather up, it almost clicks more. It's like stiffer. So see that difference? This versus this, where it just kind of is more soft. I would actually suggest to Craft and Glory, if I were to make a suggestion, that they use the same thickness of this leather on their Ghurka boot on the shafts here. I'm guessing they're using a thicker version of their buffalo hides to craft these engineers, but it actually makes the pass through a little bit more challenging. It's one thing I will say is getting these boots on and off with anything other than thin socks is some work. It's a lot of work. Some people use the trash bag method. I just try to really give it my good college try and get it on there. And while I can, and once I'm in, the foot is secure. If I use thin socks, what I notice is that there's a bit of heel slip on the back here, but if I use medium thickness socks, there is no heel slip and the boot becomes more comfortable. However, if I try to use medium thickness socks, ingress and egress from these boots is a challenge, more so than my other engineers. So maybe something to think about is adjusting the pass through a little so it makes it a little easier for the typical mid to slightly higher instep. Other than that, just maybe tapering this heel down would be nice to kind of lock in your heel a little bit better. But that's about it. I mean, I think everything else is really nice. This boot also uses largely leather components, including a leather heel stack, a leather welt here. There's no midsole, so maybe something to consider down the road would be to add a midsole, but I actually think that this is totally fine. I actually like this midsole a little bit better than the Ghurka boot, which feels a little more raw, but they're pretty comparable. Could also be improved slightly. Outsole stitching is 360 degrees here. It's available as well with stitch down construction, which I think I would have preferred. You can see the welt joint right here. Overall, really, really nicely done. Stitching on the back is reminiscent of Pacific Northwest style boots, or Wesco, I believe, has that pattern. Whites and Wescos have that pattern. But the stitching on the V-shaped ingress and egress point here is unique. And you see the triangle that you often see for fastening stitch of the buckle here. Another criticism I would have is that I'm not sure how really functional this actual buckle is. When I get my foot on, this actually seems to loosen up a little bit. And I think this buckle is a little too big. I would love to see it a little smaller. When I get my shoe on, this feels like it flops around a little bit. So if anything, I think that the buckle certainly could be improved for a 3.0 version of this engineer, to shrink it down more in accordance with other engineers. Maybe make it a little shorter, something like about that length would be better than something that's this long. Otherwise, you see this kind of happening there, right there. And I think that's something that could be worked on, but these are all minor quibbles. Really, the way that this shoe looks is actually the engineer that I get the most compliments for. People really love this harness color. They love how this boot looks on the foot. They love the rounded, slightly almond-shaped last. They love everything, and I love it. So if we could work on the pass-through, if we could work on the buckle, if we could work on maybe the thickness of this leather, make it more in line with what we see on the Ghurka boot, which rolls even more nicely in my mind than even this guy, we'd be right there. Sole here is similar to a Vibram Laundra sole, but it's not branded, as you can see. So I believe this is probably a Craft and Glory branded sole, but there's nothing marked here. I actually like the lack of marking here. It actually keeps it a little cleaner. You can see how nicely the stitch is done on the uppers with that almost Ridgeway or Laundra style heel. And if we pull in, nice multi-layered leather heel stack with, honestly, if they could just use this finish for the edge dressing on this boot, it would look a little bit nicer in my mind. So just a little bit of finishing would do that. Otherwise, look at how beautiful this guy is. It's just really striking. This is a shorter boot from an engineer standpoint than many of my other engineers, but I like the shortness, but it's not overly short. So again, while not everything is perfect, you're paying a fraction of the price to get this pair. And if you're just interested in trialing an engineer as a style, stylistically, you're not going to beat this in many, especially if you like the Pacific Northwest style of design aesthetic for engineers, more so than, say, the Japanese or traditional styles that you see coming out of other regions. Then this boot is very akin to the Pacific Northwest style of craftsmanship. Leather toe and heel stiffeners were part of this construction. They feel very, very stiff. So I think, again, I would probably try to thin out those stiffeners just ever so slightly to make this area more supple. It feels almost like Celastic in terms of how hard it is. But I was told by the team that this was leather, which I appreciate, but it doesn't feel like it has any chance of breaking in over time or collapsing, which is totally fine. I don't think it has to based on this style. But certainly having a little bit more suppleness will allow the ingress and egress and the long-term comfort of these engineers to be improved. Craft and Glory, as you can see, let's throw the belt into the picture. Their saddle tan colorway pack, so to speak. Saddle tan, saddle tan, saddle tan, all in slightly different variations of tannage and leather thickness, so you get slightly different looks, but you can tell these are all part of the same color family. And definitely give these guys a look. They're tremendous, and I hope you're doing well. Talk to you soon, okay? Take care and goodbye.